Christmas was literally associated in New England with street gangs and violence. Christmas was too divisive to be put into a cookbook. Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. It's great to see you all here. I'm feeling a little bit off today for a couple of reasons, one of which is that my camera decided to choose this morning to die. So we're recording on the phone today, which is something new for me. I haven't tried to do that before, and I'm hoping that it'll all work out okay. Today we're going to talk about the war on Christmas. Sort of. I want you to imagine a world where Christmas was outright banned. I want you to imagine a world where people took offense if you wished them a Merry Christmas. I want you to imagine parts of America where people never celebrated Christmas at all for their entire lives because it was banned or because it was culturally shamed. I want you to imagine religious people sneering at other people because they did something different on December 25th. I want you to imagine that those same people were denouncing everybody who did anything any different than they did. Is this a dystopian future? Is this the trajectory of our current war on Christmas? Well, not exactly. This is the situation in early and colonial America. So let's take a look at the war on Christmas in its original iteration in America. Now, if you're here with me, you're interested in the history of American religion, perhaps you already know that the Puritans kind of declared war on Christmas in the 17th century. But the story is far more nuanced than you might know. Because usually when I've seen people talk about the Puritan War on Christmas, they talk about it as if Americans didn't celebrate Christmas. That isn't quite right. Americans celebrated Christmas. Some of them. While others of them really did not like it if Americans celebrated Christmas. If we're going to understand colonial America, we have to understand the country that they were a part of. During the English Reformation, the monarchy and the elites forced English people to separate from the Roman Catholic Church, and this formed the Church of England. King Henry VIII was head of the Church of England, and the British monarch today is head of the Church of England and the authority on doctrine. This was to break away from the authority of the Pope. Those of you who know about the Protestant Reformation know that that was primarily based on doctrinal disputes. Martin Luther and John Calvin had critiques of the Roman Catholic Church theologically. But the English Reformation was more of a political one. In 1527, Henry VIII wanted to annul his marriage, but the Pope, Pope Clement VII, would not give him an annulment. So Henry's response was to just make up his own church. So that's when Parliament passed legislation to sever ties with the Roman Catholic Church and make Henry VIII head of the Church of England. This meant that any doctrinal disputes would be resolved by the king and not the Pope. But that doesn't mean that everyone that was involved in this was motivated by politics. People who were pejoratively called Puritans were motivated by ideology and theological views. They argued that the English Reformation hadn't gone far enough, that the English people needed to be more radical, like the Lutherans and the Calvinists. They needed to totally change things. But there were internal conflicts among the Puritans about what this would mean. Some wanted to reform the English Church in order to make a godly nation. Others wanted to separate from the established church and establish autonomous churches that were not part of the Church of England, not part of any larger ecclesiastical body. During the English Civil War in the 1640s, Puritans rose to power in England. One of the things that the Puritans did in the 1640s while they were ruling England was to ban Christmas. Christmas was popish. It was too Roman Catholic, basically. The ban on Christmas held in England for about 20 years, but that doesn't mean that nobody was celebrating Christmas. Many people who had celebrated Christmas their whole lives resented the ban, and they celebrated Christmas secretly, or not so secretly, depending on the community. The monarchy was restored in 1660, and Parliament passed new legislation. Some of this legislation was really significant for American religious history. The first was the Act of Uniformity of 1662, which established that all of the churches in the Church of England would have to align with the new Book of Common Prayer. The Anglicans, the people in the Church of England, would thus be required to follow the Book of Common Prayer for things like their liturgy and rites. It's essentially the way that they would organize their services. the way they would organize their calendar, the sort of religious rituals that they would be expected to engage in. This act of uniformity also meant that anybody who did not comply with this would not be eligible to hold office in the church or in the government. Also, in 1662, the Quaker Act required all Quakers to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. Quakers could not swear oaths out of religious conviction. So this was basically to make it illegal to be a Quaker. 2,000 clergy refused to comply with these acts, and they left the Church of England. This is known as the Great Ejection of 1662. So almost all of the Puritans left the Church of England and served in Congregationalist or Presbyterian churches after this happened. Today's Congregationalists are some of the direct descendants of the Puritans. As I said, though, the term Puritan was a pejorative. It was used not by the people themselves, but by others to describe them. And we don't really see the term Puritan being used to describe anybody in real time after the early 18th century. There was no denomination of Puritans. You can't say that a Puritan was anything really specific. What you can say about the Puritans, though, was that they had a desire to purify the church. For us today, I guess the closest thing that we can come up with was the term fundamentalist, although the term fundamentalist is used by people to describe themselves and has been historically. But it has a pejorative connotation, and a lot of people refer to people as fundamentalist who might not use that term for themselves and for whom there's not really a clear definition other than really radical or conservative. We'll talk about fundamentalists later on, but if you think about Puritans as being that kind of label, it might help you understand who we're talking about. To call people Puritans was a way of saying that they were extremists, religious extremists specifically. Actual Puritans might call themselves all sorts of things. Saints, for example. So while the Church of England was trying to rein in its rebellious ministers, some of them set sail for the New World, so-called, for North America. In New England, the Puritans sought to build a home for themselves. Puritans supported the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and also 3 colonies that would become part of what is now known as the state of Connecticut. That includes Saybrook Colony, Connecticut Colony, and New Haven Colony. Around 21,000 people moved across the Atlantic by 1641, and in New England, they established families and were quickly having children. People who are raising children in New England wanted those children to have good influences, as they would have judged that. They wanted their children to be able to read the Bible for themselves and interpret it without the influence of clergy. And they built the most literate society in the world. They often pointed out that Christmas was not in the Bible, so they weren't going to expose their kids to it. And a lot of them had moved to New England when Christmas had been banned in England itself. Like many people in American history, what the Puritans were trying to do was establish a religious utopia, one that would be free from the corrupting influences of the outside, a pure world. It's not the case that Puritans as a whole were just sticks in the mud who did not want people to have any fun. They have that reputation, perhaps partly from this time period where people were calling them Puritans because they viewed them as extremists. But you could be too extreme for the Puritans, and if you were too extreme for the Puritans, you'd get banished. And Roger Williams being banished for being too radical was the reason for the founding of the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Being banned for being too radical for the Puritans is a great story, one that I hope that I'll be able to tell you at another time. Suffice it to say, though, that this was a society that had been primed to be anti-Christmas, and they also had the cultural authority to pull it off. It's also important for us to observe that there is very little correlation between the experience of a modern American Christmas and the 17th century Christmas that the Puritans were trying to stamp out. December in early modern Europe was about the only time that people would have fresh meat, because you wanted to wait for slaughter until the meat might not go bad because it was cold enough to prevent that. And then they would salt the meat to preserve it. Also, it was the time that the year's supply of beer and wine was finally ready to drink. So in December, one drank and feasted on things that you wouldn't necessarily get any other time of year. There is one Christmas tradition that is still held in some parts of the United Kingdom and Ireland, Eastern Canada, and Philadelphia, which is called mummering, but we don't really see this mostly today. We actually do something similar, or some people do, on Halloween, although it's a little less aggressive. Mummers would dress themselves in disguises and go to homes of other people in the community, usually wealthy people in the community, and they would perform skits or music, all kinds of things like that. It was some form of entertainment in exchange for an expected payment in treats, basically in food or drink. So if you didn't give the mummers what they expected, then they would trash your house, basically break your windows, that kind of thing. So it's trick or treat taken to the extreme with a group of people who can't be identified and also who might very well be drunk. They could be quite violent toward people as well as in their acts of vandalism. It could be really problematic to be visited by mummers, especially if you were against Christmas and didn't want to participate. Another thing, besides the fact that people were becoming intoxicated while they were going around door to door, is that the performances were racy or, offensive to the sensibilities of many Puritans. Essentially, I want you to imagine Christmas as a time when you have a bunch of rowdy drunk people going door to door, performing off-color jokes and skits and songs and disrupting people's lives. Puritans didn't like it. They wanted to avoid this. The Puritans of New England didn't want Christmas defiling their pure world, and they agreed with the Puritans in England who had banned it. So the first year that these settlers were in Massachusetts, on December 25th, they just worked as usual. But that doesn't mean that absolutely everyone who came to the colony was as committed to these ideas as others or would have the same views. This became an issue for the second Christmas they were there. There were some new people who had come to the colony, and they said that it was a matter of conscience for them. They needed to celebrate Christmas. So they were excused from work, but later the governor found them playing a game in the street and got angry and told them that if it was a matter of conscience, they should go home, but they really shouldn't be playing games and things while other people were working. These tensions are one of the reasons that Massachusetts banned public celebrations of Christmas outright in 1659. The fine, if you were caught, was 5 shillings. As an example of the kind of families who might celebrate Christmas anyway, we have the story of William Hoare. William was part of a rebellious family. They would break into the Reverend John Hale's house while he was away and steal his food regularly. And they would steal other things. Puritans made William Hoare answer for allowing people to drink in his house on Christmas in 1662. They called it keeping Christmas, not observing Christmas, but keeping it. You can't keep it. So the Hoares were, as I said, a rebellious family, and William's wife Dorcas was a fortune teller who was rumored to be a witch, and when the Salem witch controversy came, she was sentenced to death in the Salem witch trials. We should talk more about Salem, but we're going to move on from here. Let me know if you want to know more about Salem, because that's another one of those things that I think people don't really understand today. So if you think about it this way, Christmas was associated with mischief and criminality. But England was trying to move on from the Puritan era, and in 1681, the king ordered Massachusetts to repeal their law banning the keeping of Christmas. Even though it wasn't illegal, that doesn't mean that New England as a whole really got into Christmas at this point. And when the young people showed signs that they were dabbling in Christmas, then ministers would become distressed and tell them that they shouldn't do that. In 1697, Samuel Sewall found out that several members of his congregation had gone to a Huguenot service in Boston for Christmas, and also that his children had wanted to go. He wrote in his diary about how distressed he was about this and how he had to tell his children what a horrible thing that would be if they had gone to keep Christmas with Huguenots. This was a group of other Christians who had come to the area via France. We can talk about them another time. Anyway, this is the thing. Not all of the people around were Puritans. Sewall cited Psalm 16 in his diary, evidence of his great distress, that his children were being drawn into this bad influence by these people who are keeping Christmas. Their sorrows shall be multiplied, that I hasten after another god. Their drink offerings of blood I will not offer, nor take up their names into my lips. Cotton Mather was another person who really railed against Christmas. You probably know Cotton Mather, if you know him at all, for his involvement in the Salem witch trials, but he wrote a lot. He was influential as a Puritan thinker. In 1689, he wrote that a woman's desire to keep Christmas was evidence of demon possession. Moreover, both she at my house and her sister at home at the time, which they call Christmas, were by the demons made very drunk, though they had no strong drink, as we are fully sure, to make them so. When she began to feel herself thus drunk, she complained, "Oh, they say they will have me to keep Christmas with them. They will disgrace me when they can do nothing else." But Mather's strongest condemnation of Christmas came in 1712, when he found out that people in his congregation, young people, had attended a Christmas dance. He responded with a fiery anti-Christmas sermon where he denounced Christmas as blasphemy. Can you in your own conscience think that our Holy Savior is honored by mad mirth, by long eating, by hard drinking, by lewd gaming, by rude reveling, by a mass fit for none but a Saturn or a Bacchus, or the night of a Mohammedan Ramadan? And he did say Mohammedan Ramadan, at least that's how he spelled it, but you get the idea. Christmas is Muslim, like Ramadan, right? You cannot possibly think so. If you will yet go on and do such things, I forewarn you that the burning wrath of God will break forth among you. As I said, Cotton Mather was a major influence on Puritan thinking and is best known today, if he's known at all, for his involvement with the Salem witch trials. But I do want to say that Mather was not a one-dimensional thinker like you might think based on all of this. He was a nuanced person. Now, genuinely, though, there was a problem with Christmas, as you might imagine, based on the mummers. If you have people aggressively going around, basically shaking people down for food and drink, and then beating them up or tearing up their houses if they don't, even setting aside the possible negative influence they might have for having all these bawdy skits, it's problematic. For example, Boston had a Christmas gang, basically. This was a group called the Boston Antics. These were organized bands of wassailing mummers who went around Boston for about 30 years. This started in the 1760s. They would go to wealthy people's homes, perform off-color skits, and demand money in payment. There was one Boston resident, Samuel Breck, who said of them, "Custom had licensed these vagabonds to enter, even by force, any place they chose. Christmas was literally associated in New England with street gangs and violence. Presbyterians, Quakers, Methodists, and Baptists all objected to Christmas. Puritans called it Fool's Tide, and Quakers sarcastically called it the day called Christmas." Given that not a whole lot of people were immigrating to New England until well into the 19th century, past this sort of initial migration, they had really strong social control over the region, and for a couple of centuries, Christmas really wasn't part of the culture in New England. It's one of the reasons why Thanksgiving was really established as a major fall and winter holiday there. In 1874, Henry Ward Beecher was reflecting on his past in his own New England town and said that Christmas wasn't really celebrated by anybody except the Episcopalians. Episcopalians, of course, were Anglicans, so after the American Revolution, not wanting to be associated with the Church of England, they were still using things like the Book of Common Prayer and following that kind of liturgy, but they didn't want to call themselves Anglicans. They were not English, but they celebrated Christmas. Peter Kalm was a Swedish explorer. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences commissioned him to head to North America to collect seeds and plant life for potential agricultural study, and in the 1740s, he had the chance to observe an American Christmas. In 1749, in Philadelphia, he said that Christmas was very different. He wrote that Quakers didn't pay any attention to it. Stores were open and anyone might sell or purchase what he wanted, but servants had a 3-day vacation period. But also, as Kalm observed, there were many people in North America who did celebrate Christmas. Catholics, Lutherans, Moravians, and Anglicans, later Episcopalians, all did celebrate Christmas. Kalm wrote that Catholics were the most into Christmas, and they celebrated it in Philadelphia by decorating their churches with evergreen branches. And they also had special music to mark the occasion. I don't have a whole lot of time today, so I'm not going to go too deep into this. But if you were to look in the history of Christmas hymns that you might sing today, a lot of them do date from centuries ago, but not really until Christmas becomes more established as a holiday here. So Christmas hymns and carols and those sorts of things, because Christmas songs were associated with the mummering and the street gangs and all that kind of thing. They weren't really religious in nature until then. So your favorite Christmas music, if you have it, probably dates from a little bit later on. In these ethnically diverse cities like Philadelphia and New York, wealthy people would have lavish parties with lots of food and drink for Christmas. They would have balls, people would dance. It was a real social time, and it was very extravagant. And many people were critical of that as a waste of money that could have been spent in better ways. There was a lot of division over Christmas. So Calm wrote, "One did not seem to know what it meant to wish anyone a Merry Christmas." And because Americans couldn't agree on Christmas, the government basically ignored it. People often viewed Christmas as itself a British holiday, and they were not British, so they were not going to celebrate it. They were done being British. This was not the case in the South, though. In the American South, Christmas was a full-on 2-week celebration of the 12 days of Christmas, and they had a variety of traditions of their own, many of which you also probably won't be observing today if you were to see a traditional, so-called American Christmas. The 12 days of Christmas run from December 25th to January 5th. And one of the traditions is that school children would nail the doors of the school shut so that they couldn't have lessons during those 2 weeks. On Christmas Day, cannons and guns would be fired in the morning to mark the holiday, and special food might be served. People would also give tips to servants and enslaved people, what we might call a Christmas tip today, but they called a Christmas box. Even so, other things would go on as usual. Mail delivery was standard. The mail service was, of course, a federal thing, so Christmas was not a federal holiday. You can expect the mail to be delivered. There were still a lot of people working on Christmas. The servants and enslaved people might have extra work to do. That was true at Mount Vernon, where George Washington lived, because he would have a lot of visitors. But some people who would otherwise be marginalized in society would still have a little bit of a reprieve for Christmas. So it would be the people who were enslaved and working inside the house at Mount Vernon, for example, who would be working extra, whereas the people who worked outdoors in the fields would have 4 days off for Christmas. In New York, winter holidays became a political statement. So yes, there was some celebration of Christmas, but also of St. Nicholas Day. The Dutch, who had settled in New York first as New Amsterdam, had prioritized New Year's Day, so that was also a big celebration for people. St. Nicholas Day was on December 6th. In the 1770s, New Yorkers would celebrate St. Nicholas Day as a way of kind of thumbing their noses at the St. George Society. They were making this political statement against the St. George Society because they were Tories, they were loyal to the British Crown. Essentially, New Yorkers had chosen a Dutch holiday, as St. Nicholas Day was viewed, to thumb their noses at the English loyalists. But St. Nicholas Day and its Sinterklaas were later, of course, St. Nicholas, Santa Claus, became enfolded into what became the traditional American Christmas. So Christmas was a political statement, it was a controversy, it was all kinds of things. And all of this conflict meant that the people of early America, in order to avoid the kind of conflict that might arise from mentioning Christmas, might not do it if they were trying to do something in a commercial enterprise. For example, cookbooks published in the American market might not include Christmas recipes. They had election cakes and Washington cakes and federal cakes. These were meant to be served on the holidays that everyone shared. But Christmas was too divisive to be put into a cookbook. For example, The Art of Cookery, when published in 1803 in England, had Christmas recipes. But the Christmas recipes were removed from The Art of Cookery when it was published in 1805 in Alexandria, Virginia, for an American market. Christmas was too British for many American revolutionaries. It was too Catholic for people who were really still committed to Puritan ideas. It just wasn't part of their traditions in the culture if they were in New England. It was not by any means the kind of universal holiday that many people might imagine it ever was. Christmas has always had its fraught moments in America. And I would love to tell you how many Americans came to embrace Christmas more fully in the 19th century and developed traditions that we know today as an American Christmas. But that is really all the time that I have for today. So let me know in the comments whether it surprises you to learn that Christmas was so problematic for such a long time for Americans. And if you'd like to hear tales of the religious history of the United States that time has forgotten, you can subscribe. That's what we do here on this channel. So, until next time, my imaginary friends, stay safe and stay curious. I will see you again soon, hopefully with my regular camera, but who knows what will happen. I'm so glad to have been here and to have been able to share this with you. Bye-bye.